This is why your mobility routine sucks. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Max Wardell. We're going to talk about flexibility versus mobility in this video and why you're not really maximizing your mobility or flexibility routine. I'd like to start with a few definitions first. We talk about flexibility, we talk about mobility. I'm going to define these the way the scientific literature does, and we'll kind of move into what you should be doing at home and how you can alter or augment your program to make it more efficient. I can't tell you how many times athletes have come to me over at Athletic Institute and said, well, I work on hip mobility, I work on lower body mobility for 30 minutes a day, every day. I ask them how long they've been doing it. And they say, well, I've been doing it for a year. And they have horrible flexibility. They can't get into the positions. They just don't have hip abduction, they don't have good rotation, but they've been working on it 30 minutes a day. And it's not because they're not working hard, it's because their program isn't optimized. And a lot of it's because they see all this crap on social media, they see all this garbage on Instagram of how they should be working on hip mobility or even on YouTube. It just sucks. So this video, we're going to go through why we need to change the way we talk about it and how we need to go through a good flexibility routine. So flexibility versus mobility, which is a lot of times we hear mobility is you moving through range of motion with control. Technically, that's not the definition of mobility. That's become popular recently, but flexibility is the range of motion that a joint has. What we're talking about when you say mobility is active flexibility, your ability to move through range of motion actively, to activate through that range of motion. So flexibility can fit in one of kind of four quadrants here. It can fit in dynamic active, meaning you're moving and contracting. It can fit into dynamic passive, you're moving but you're not contracting. It can fit into active static, where you're contracting but not moving, or passive static, where you're relaxed and you're also not moving. So it's either moving or not, or it's contracting or not. That's your four categories of flexibility. Mobility, specifically related to the human body, refers to your ability to move about a mobile base of support, your ability to move around in three-dimensional space. That's why we call crutches, wheelchairs, walkers, mobility devices. So your ability to move through space is mobility. Now, we also have what's called joint mobility, which is your joint or one joint surface ability to move relative to another joint surface in three-dimensional space. You can see it's moving about the joint. So we have joint mobility and we have flexibility when it comes to your movement capacity. That's what it is. We spend all of this time on these flexibility routines. Trust me, we're going to go through some stuff later and we call them mobility routines, but really the dosage is off. We're not doing it frequent enough, improper application all around. So we're going to just talk briefly about how you guys can move through that. I want to make a note on something called joint morphology, or how your joint surfaces are shaped, the geometry of your joints prior to moving into some of this stuff. A lot of times athletes will spend a lot of time working on a specific range of motion that they're deficient in without even realizing that it's not going to be a possibility based on their bony anatomy. Depending on what source you read, 15 to maybe 37% of males have what's called cam lesions or cam deformities of the femur as it fits into the hip socket. What that means is, as you can see on the screen here, there's a little extra bone where that head, the ball of the femur, comes into the neck. When that happens, that's going to limit some motion in different planes. Sometimes it's not going to give you significant limitations, sometimes it is. I'm somebody that had significant limitations from those deformities. Now, there's potential reasons why that can occur: genetics, growth plate injuries when you're younger in your hips, developmental things. We don't really know all of them, but we know that it occurs in a decent percentage of the population. There's other morphology characteristics, there's other changes in the way the hip can be shaped that limit your rotation. So I particularly had one athlete who actually trained a lot of athletes, and he kept saying, I just don't have this hip internal rotation, the ability of my ankle to rotate out. He didn't have it because that was just the bony shape of his femur, the femoral neck head junction there. So you may have some of that. So if you're getting pinching in the front of the hip, the outside of the hip going into some of these, that's something to be cognizant of. I would get evaluated by a physiotherapist or a physical therapist here in the US that can look at your hip structure and anatomy and kind of direct you in the best pathway of what you may and may not be able to do if you are getting pinching, painful symptoms in the hip when you try to do your hip mobility. Really, remember, flexibility, that's the range of motion that a joint can display. Mobility being, or specifically joint mobility, meaning the slide and glide of a joint surface on another. So let's go through some things that you need to start considering in your mobility or flexibility program. Now that we're in a stretch here, let's first talk about a few of those variations. Remember, we have static active, static passive, we have dynamic active, dynamic passive, and we're gonna talk about static passive first. And it's often demonized on social media, online, by strength and conditioning coaches, by a lot of people who probably don't have great flexibility. Part of the reason for that is we've seen some research in recent years that shows, oh, if you static stretch before doing some power activity, it's going to decrease your power. But those studies are done in a way where they'll stretch something for 2 minutes, sometimes longer, and then they go right into a vertical leap or right into a sprint after, which is really not what anyone would do in real life. You would maybe stretch for 30 seconds or a minute, increase your range of motion, do some dynamic variations like some high knees, some active stuff, practice a little sport skill, and then 40 minutes later you might do your power activity or your sport. And in those cases, we see there's really not any detriment to power or strength or speed from doing a little bit of a reasonable 30-second to a minute static passive relaxed stretch. Another thing, as far as increasing range of motion, I don't think there's any way that you could say static passive stretching doesn't increase range of motion. It's been tried and true, shown over and over again in the literature. I would say if you're going to say this type of stretching where you're just holding the stretch, hanging out, doesn't work, then you ought to go into a ballet studio or a gymnastics gym and say, hey, that doesn't work. You guys better stop doing that while they're in the middle of their middle splits. It definitely works to increase range of motion. Now, is it the best stretch or the best way to increase flexibility for everybody? No. Does it increase flexibility? 100%. So think about adding some static passive stretching into your routine. Think about the dosage. What we say is 10 to 20 minutes per muscle per week. If you can break that up over 4 or 5 days, that's better than doing it over 2 or 3 days. So hold the stretches for a longer duration. We say a minimum of a minute, up to 5 minutes. Try to hit that 15-minute mark if you can. 10 to 20 minutes per muscle per week. So static passive stretching is a great option, but it's not always what you need to do when you're in the stretch. You can also do static active variations. I would really say if you don't have good flexibility, if you can't just get into the positions, you need to hang out there for minutes at a time per week. You got to get in there for 10 to 20 minutes per week. Get close to that 20-minute mark on some of these tissues in that position that you want to acquire. Doing dynamic activations and CARs, controlled articular rotations, which were made popular by Andrew Spina from FRC, those are great things. Those are great warm-up activities. Those are great to reinforce range of motion that you already have in a passive manner, but they're not going to increase your flexibility or your static passive flexibility to any great extent. And if you don't have static passive flexibility, your active range never exceeds your passive range. So you got to increase your passive range. And if you look at that system, that FRC system, they do long duration hold. They do various contract, relax, agonist, contract type of stretches where they're going to push into this as hard as they can. So now I'm crushing this pole with my heel, activating my hamstrings and my hip extensors, and then I'm going to relax and I'll go further. Or I can actually activate and pull my leg off, and now I'm activating my hip flexors into a shortened range. So there's a lot of ways to do active stretching, and you can do it statically or dynamically, but I have to have the passive range first. So if I'm spending all this time on these dynamic hip oscillations where I'm going from 90-90 position from IR to ER, and I don't even have much hip internal rotation or much hip external rotation, static passive stretching or static active stretching is going to be the key to spend the amount of time in those positions to actually create tissue extensibility, which means the ability of tissue to lengthen in those positions prior to doing those, and I can reinforce them and develop some muscular or neuromuscular control in those positions by doing that after. So if you're not spending enough time in the range of motion you want to acquire, you're not going to acquire it. If you're trying to do dynamic control variations where you're going to do different articular ranges or different positions, you're going to try to move through them, that stuff's great to reinforce range of motion you have, and that's why you see it being promoted by people that have great flexibility. They have great static flexibility where they have passive range all the way through, and they have great range of motion. And then they're gonna show you how you can increase your range by doing these just different hip circles and those sorts of things. And what I'm gonna say is, for somebody that's stiff, probably not. You're trying to watch somebody that's hypermobile and flexible teach you how to become hypermobile and flexible, but they never had to learn it. They were just naturally hypermobile and flexible to begin with. You need to spend time at your end range, and that can incorporate active contraction, trying to strengthen at your end range. That can incorporate you just hanging out there. It's been shown time and time again in the literature that it works, and the reason is because stretching can cause structural change to tissue and can decrease some neurological tension and tone. And that's another point here. If you just have high tone where you have great flexibility but it feels tight, doing those dynamic variations where you're doing rotations and ranges of motion, those are going to work phenomenal for you. And that's what a lot of people have seen, where they feel tight or they feel stiff, but they're not really stiff. They just don't have good control of their end range, or they have high tonicity, muscle tone, neurological tightening, and they do those and they increase their range dramatically very fast. That's fine. Those are great to use in your warm-up because of that. If you really have range of motion restrictions, you got to hang out at your end range, increase your flexibility. I strongly suggest that everybody go check out Dan Van Zandt flexibility.research on Instagram. He's got some great content. He's really an expert in the field, and he'll talk to you and lay out different posts on various ranges of motion and ways you can increase your flexibility. Let's talk about practical application. Now, you've seen me do some hamstring variations, just some slant board calf stretching, some stuff for the front of the hip here. But one thing that I really suggest to a lot of people is hit the big movements first. If you increase your hip flexion, hamstring flexibility, and hip abduction and hip extension, you're gonna improve your rotational range, your internal rotation, your external rotation easily. So what I suggest here is work on a front split. You can do this isometrically with an isometric hold. I've gone from about 12 inches from the floor down to almost hamstring touching the floor, about a little less than a half an inch from touching the floor, as you can see here on the screen, just by working on it myself. And I'll do isometric holds. I'll be in that split with my muscles holding me up, holding for 30 seconds, 4 sets, working up to 2 minutes. Maybe start at 30 seconds, that's fine, just 1 set. Or do some passive variations. Work on just the butt on wall middle split, where you're letting the legs come out. Work on the adductor flexibility and the hip capsule. So you're gonna hit hip extension, hip flexion. You can work on some rectus stuff like this. You've seen me do the couch stretch before. You could do something like this. Work on some of those long muscles across the front of the hip. But if you did the couch stretch, a front split stretch, and a middle split stretch, you would hit all the ranges of motion that you're really gonna need to hit in the hip. And keep in mind those morphology things we talked about in the beginning of the video. And if you still have hip internal rotation deficits or external rotation deficits at the end, you can absolutely hit them. But instead of that 90-90 hip stretch that most people can't get into comfortably and get a good tissue stretch anyway, I suggest this stretch, as you can see on the screen here, that's been made popular by the knees over toes guy, Ben Patrick. We've shown it in some videos in the past. It's a great way to really overload hip extension on the back leg, but also hip rotation into external rotation on the front leg. If you guys like this video or is new information, hit the thumbs up and subscribe. Hit the bell for notifications so you don't miss any of those, and we'll see you guys in the next video.